The night my father's empire celebrated 40 years of power, I stood under the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by crystal glasses and polite applause. I thought I had learned to endure his words, the sharp cuts hidden behind his smiles. But when he lifted a chair and drove it into my ribs, the air left my body, along with any illusion that I was still his daughter. Somewhere in that frozen room, a lens caught everything: his rage, my silence, and the moment our family's mask finally shattered. That recording would become my weapon, and the FBI would know my name. The marble floors of the Grand Regent Hotel glistened under the warm glow of the chandeliers, and the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume hung in the air. I walked in alone, the click of my heels lost in the swell of laughter and clinking glasses. Every detail screamed opulence, from the towering floral arrangements to the waiters gliding past with trays of champagne. It should have felt like a celebration, but my stomach had been tight since the invitation arrived. Tonight was the 40th anniversary gala of Clark & Sons Real Estate, my father's empire, and I already knew my role in the evening was to be invisible. I spotted them across the ballroom near the stage. My mother Evelyn in an emerald silk gown that matched the stones in her earrings, her smile calculated for the camera flashes, and my father Richard standing beside her in a custom-tailored tuxedo. Brandon, my younger brother, and the golden child stood with them, his arms slung around my father's shoulder, as if they were co-CEOs of the world. The sight made my chest tighten. I moved toward a small table in the back, the one with my name neatly printed on a place card no one else had touched. A waiter poured me a glass of water without asking, his eyes flicking toward the stage, as if to say, "You'll want to watch this." The speeches began. The first few were harmless enough: board members praising the company's growth, a long-time client telling a polite story. Then my father took the microphone. His voice filled the ballroom with the authority of a man used to being listened to. He spoke of hard work, vision, and legacy, each word punctuated with a proud glance at Brandon. And then he said it. That Brandon was the future of the company, the perfect example of success, the kind of man any father would be proud to call his son. My pulse quickened. He didn't look at me once. It was as if I had ceased to exist. Without thinking, I stood up. My chair scraped against the polished floor, turning more than a few heads. I walked toward the stage, my voice steady but loud enough to carry over the polite applause. I told him that success wasn't measured by the title you were handed or the family name on your business card. That there were others in the family who had worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much, but had never been given the same chance. The room went still. My father's smile didn't falter at first, but his eyes narrowed in a way I knew too well. He stepped forward, his hand tightening around the edge of the microphone stand. The air felt heavier. I could see my mother shifting uncomfortably, glancing at the cameras. I was about to step back to leave it at that when he moved. It happened so fast, I almost didn't process it. His hand shot to the chair beside him, and in one swift motion, he swung it toward me. The impact was brutal, the sharp edge catching my side with a force that knocked the air out of my lungs. Pain exploded across my ribs, and the world tilted as I stumbled back, hitting the floor hard. Gasps and shouts rippled through the crowd. I could hear the clatter of glass, the hurried steps of people rushing toward me, and somewhere in the chaos, my father's voice still trying to control the narrative. I tasted copper, and with every shallow breath I felt the searing ache in my chest. As I lay there, my vision catching glimpses of sequined gowns and polished shoes, I noticed a man a few feet away, holding up his phone. Peter Lang. I would later learn his name. He wasn't panicking like the others. He was recording his expression unreadable. The camera was steady, pointed directly at me, and at my father, still standing with the chair in his hand. The hotel staff arrived, crouching beside me, their voices low but urgent. My hearing was muffled, every sound underwater. I focused on breathing, on not letting the black edges in my vision close in. Hands helped me up, guiding me toward the exit, as the room's noise swelled into a mixture of outrage, confusion, and the relentless click of cameras. I didn't look back at him. I didn't need to. I could still feel the weight of the blow, the shock settling into my bones, and the faint but certain knowledge that nothing in our family would ever be the same again. Two paramedics guided me through the hotel's side exit, the night air hitting my face like a shock of cold reality. The siren from the waiting ambulance stayed silent, probably to avoid drawing more attention, but the flashing lights still caught in the glass doors as they closed behind me. I was eased onto the gurney, my side screaming with every shift of weight. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sterile smells and clipped questions from the EMT. I gave short answers, conserving what little breath I had. At St. Luke's Medical Center, the bright overhead lights felt almost cruel. Dr. Brooks appeared quickly, a tall man with calm eyes that didn't linger on the bruises starting to bloom along my ribs. He pressed gently along my side, asking where it hurt the most, and I clenched my jaw against the sharp pain. A nurse rolled me toward radiology for x-rays, and the mechanical hum of the machine filled the silence. Back in the exam room, Dr. Brooks studied the images before turning to me. 2 fractures along the 7th and 8th ribs, he said, likely from blunt force trauma. He spoke clinically, but not without empathy, explaining that the ribs would need time and careful management to heal. He began filling out a formal injury report, his pen moving steadily over the paper. I caught the words consistent with assault. Evelyn arrived before the nurse finished bandaging my side. She swept into the room in her evening gown, her expression a mask of controlled irritation. She didn't ask how I felt. Instead, she adjusted her clutch under her arm and told me I needed to let this go before it ruined the family's reputation. Her voice was low, but sharp enough to cut through the fog of pain. I asked if she saw what happened. She looked away and said it was a misunderstanding, that I had provoked my father in front of important people. The nurse froze for a second, then quietly stepped out of the room. I told her I wasn't going to pretend it didn't happen. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She warned me that if I pushed this, I would regret it, then left without another word. The sound of her heels on the tile faded until the only thing left was the steady beep from the monitor beside me. My phone buzzed on the side table. Charlotte's name lit the screen. I answered, my voice shaky but controlled. She was already aware, her words coming fast and tight. A colleague in Boston had seen a social media post from someone at the gala. She asked if I was safe, if I wanted her to come right away. I told her about the ribs, about Mom's visit, about how Dad hadn't even shown up. She didn't hesitate. She said she would be on the first flight out in the morning. When the room went quiet again, I stared at the ceiling, feeling each throb in my side. Beneath the pain was something else, something steadier. For years I had let the weight of their disapproval keep me in my place. Tonight had cracked that open. My father's hand, the chair, the sting in my ribs, it had stripped away the last pretense that this family could be fixed with civility. A nurse returned with discharge papers and a packet of instructions. Rest, ice, pain management, no heavy lifting. She helped me into fresh clothes, moving slowly so I could breathe through each movement. A cab was called, and the orderly who wheeled me out didn't ask questions, though I caught the way he glanced at my side, then back to my face. The city was quieter than usual, the streets damp from an earlier rain. Streetlights reflected in small puddles along the curb. As the cab pulled away from the hospital, I leaned back against the seat, one arm wrapped protectively around my ribs. The skyline blurred past, but my thoughts were sharp. I could feel the pieces of something taking shape, not yet a plan, but the beginning of one. When I reached my apartment, the doorman looked startled. He asked if I was all right, and I gave him a nod that was more habit than truth. Inside, I lowered myself carefully onto the couch. The apartment felt smaller tonight, or maybe I was just more aware of the walls closing in. I sat there for a long time, listening to the muted hum of the city, outside the ache in my side, anchoring me in the present. Charlotte would be here soon. And when she arrived, I knew the conversation we were about to have would be different from any we'd had before. Something had shifted, and it wasn't going back. The next afternoon, a knock at my door pulled me out of a restless half-sleep. I opened it to find Grandma Rosemary standing there in a navy wool coat, her silver hair swept neatly back, her sharp eyes scanning me like she was taking inventory. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood. She set her purse on the coffee table and sat down studying the way I was holding my side. "You look like hell," she said quietly, but there was no pity in her voice. I sank into the armchair across from her and tried to shrug it off. She told me she had heard everything, that she had her own sources in the city, and that none of it surprised her. I asked what she meant. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands over the curve of her cane, and told me that men like my father did not just wake up one day and decide to humiliate their daughters in public. It was in his nature, the same nature that had made her life miserable decades ago. Her words caught me off guard. I had always known there was tension between her and my father, but the details had never been clear. She told me that when she was younger, she had worked alongside my grandfather in the early days of Clark & Sons. She had built client lists, brokered deals, even handled negotiations when my grandfather was out of town. But when he died, Richard pushed her out, convincing the board she had no place in the business. He cut her out of decision-making, out of profits, and eventually out of the family's financial trust. Her voice stayed steady, but I could see the old hurt in her eyes. Then she said something that made me sit up despite the ache in my ribs. She had kept something. 15 years ago, she came across a set of documents showing transactions that were not just unethical, but possibly criminal. Real estate sales laundered through shell companies overseas, accounts linked to names no one could trace. She had packed every scrap of it into a fireproof box and locked it away. I asked why she had never used it. She said timing was everything, and until now the cost of bringing it out would have outweighed the good it could do. But seeing me in that hospital bed, hearing what he had done, she knew it was time. The room felt suddenly smaller. I imagined this box sitting quietly somewhere for more than a decade, holding proof that could unravel my father's empire. I asked her where it was. She smiled faintly, almost like she had been waiting for me to ask. "In my house in the Hamptons," she said. "Upstairs in the cedar closet behind the false panel. I will give it to you, but only if you promise to think before you use it." I told her I had no intention of rushing into anything, but inside my thoughts were already moving faster than I could catch them. She reached for her purse and pulled out a single key, heavy and brass, its teeth worn from age. She placed it on the table between us. My fingers hovered over it for a second before I picked it up. We sat in silence for a while. The hum of traffic outside drifted through the windows, and the faint smell of her lavender perfume mixed with the bitter scent of my cooling coffee. She asked how badly I was hurt, and I told her about the fractures. She nodded, her expression unreadable, as if she had expected nothing less from Richard. Before she left, she touched my arm gently. "Do not let him define the story," she said. Her words settled in my mind, heavier than the key now resting in my pocket. I walked her to the door, watching her disappear down the hallway with the steady rhythm of her cane tapping against the floor. When I closed the door, the apartment felt quieter, but my mind was anything but. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back down, and turned the key over in my hand again and again. It was more than metal. It was a thread leading somewhere I had never dared to go, and now that it was in my possession, I knew I would follow it. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. A news alert flashed across the screen with a photo of Brandon beaming beside my father at Clark & Sons headquarters. The headline announced that he had been granted an additional 10% stake in the company, a reward for his unwavering dedication and leadership. My stomach twisted, not from surprise, but from the blatant audacity. Less than 24 hours after I had been hit hard enough to fracture 2 ribs, they were celebrating him. I scrolled through the article, each line feeling like a calculated message aimed directly at me. There was no mention of the gala incident, of course, only a polished narrative about legacy and growth. I could picture my father dictating the quotes himself, his voice dripping with self-importance. The second buzz came almost immediately after. This time it was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me swipe to answer. The voice on the other end was calm but deliberate. "This is Ethan Morales," he said, a financial investigative reporter. "I'm working on a piece about an international money laundering network, and Clark & Sons keeps coming up." I froze, my eyes darting toward the pocket of my coat where the brass key still rested. He explained that his investigation had started with suspicious property transactions in Miami and the Bahamas, but the deeper he dug, the more threads led back to shell companies tied to my father's firm. He said he was reaching out because I might have insight that could help connect the dots. I told him I couldn't talk freely on the phone. My voice was low, cautious, the way you speak when you know the walls might have ears. We agreed to meet in a quiet coffee shop in Soho that afternoon. The place was nearly empty when I arrived. Ethan was easy to spot, tall with dark hair and a weathered leather notebook in front of him. He greeted me with a firm handshake and the kind of look that told me he already knew more than he was saying. We talked for nearly an hour, and with every detail he shared, the picture of my father's dealings became sharper. Offshore accounts, property flips at inflated values, transfers routed through companies that didn't seem to exist outside of a name on paper. When I asked how certain he was about Clark and Son's involvement, he tapped his notebook. "Enough to know the smoke is real, but I need the fire," he said. I thought of the box in Grandma Rosemary's cedar closet. I didn't tell him about it, not yet. But I could feel the path narrowing toward a moment where I would have to decide how far I was willing to go. As we were leaving, Ethan warned me to be careful. He said people tied to these networks tended to protect themselves aggressively, and my last name alone might make me a target. Back in my apartment, I stood by the window, watching the late afternoon traffic crawl along the street. The city looked the same as it always did, but I felt like I was staring at a map of something dangerous, every intersection leading to another risk. My phone chimed again. This time it was a message from Charlotte letting me know she had landed and was heading my way. The thought of seeing her brought a small measure of relief, but I knew it wouldn't erase the weight pressing on me. I poured another coffee and sat at the table, the day's conversations replaying in my head. Brandon was being rewarded while I was still nursing broken bones. My father was deep in something far darker than I had imagined. And now there was someone on the outside watching, taking notes, ready to blow it open. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, fading into the hum of the city. I leaned back in my chair, one hand resting over my ribs, and felt the tension coil tighter inside me. The cracks in my family's mask were showing, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing began to splinter. Charlotte arrived at my apartment just after dusk, her suitcase still in hand. She set it down and hugged me carefully, mindful of my ribs. The familiar scent of her perfume and the steady grip of her arms were grounding in a way I hadn't realized I needed. She pulled back and studied my face, then glanced at the wrapped bandage under my shirt. "I'm here now," she said, and I could hear the steel beneath her voice. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything from the gala to my meeting with Ethan. She listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing only when I mentioned Dad's press release about Brandon. When I finished, she leaned forward and said we needed to be smart, that legal channels were the only way to make this stick. She reminded me that emotions could be used against me, that people like our father thrived on baiting others into mistakes. The next afternoon, Ethan texted to ask if I could meet him again in Soho. Charlotte insisted on coming with me. At the coffee shop, Ethan greeted us with his leather notebook and a thin folder of printed spreadsheets. He laid them out between our cups, pointing to a diagram he had drawn that mapped out the connections between Clark and Sons, multiple shell companies, and bank accounts in Zurich, Panama, and the Cayman Islands. The lines crisscrossed like a spider web, each intersection marked with transaction amounts that made my stomach tighten. He explained how certain properties were bought and sold at inflated prices. Within weeks, the profits siphoned into offshore accounts under names that didn't appear anywhere else in the corporate structure. The pattern was consistent, he said, and too precise to be coincidence. I asked if he had enough to publish. "Not yet," he replied. "I need a direct link tying Richard Clark personally to the accounts." Charlotte asked what would happen if we found that link. Ethan's expression hardened. "Then it moves from being a financial exposé to potential criminal charges. That's when people like the FBI get interested." We were halfway through discussing how to corroborate the paper trail when Charlotte's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then froze. Her eyes flicked to me before she excused herself and stepped outside to take the call. I watched her through the glass, pacing slowly, her free hand pressed to her forehead. When she came back in, Her face was unreadable until she slid her phone across the table toward me. On the screen was a text from an unknown number. It read, "My name is Peter Lang. I was at the Clark & Sons gala. I have a high-resolution video of the incident with your father. I filmed it from less than 10 feet away. I am willing to share it if my identity stays completely confidential." For a moment, the noise of the cafe faded into a dull hum. I remembered Peter vaguely from the event, a tall man in a dark suit lingering near the bar. The idea that someone had captured the entire assault from that close made my pulse quicken. Ethan glanced at the message, his eyes widening slightly before he looked at me. "If it's what he says, that video changes everything." Charlotte typed back a brief response, agreeing to speak under his terms. Almost immediately, Peter replied with a secure link and instructions to download the file only once, then delete the message. She forwarded it to my phone. My thumb hovered over the link, but I didn't press it. Not yet. We left the cafe together, the winter air biting against my skin. Charlotte walked beside me in silence until we reached the curb. Then she said quietly that the video was more than proof of what Dad had done to me. It was leverage, the kind that could open doors and close them just as quickly. Back in my apartment, I sat on the couch with my phone in my lap. The link glowed faintly on the screen, a small portal to something that could tilt the balance entirely in my favor. I didn't open it. Instead, I let the weight of it settle over me, knowing that once I saw it, there would be no turning back. The next morning, I woke to the ping of an incoming email. My eyes were still heavy when I opened it, but the subject line jolted me fully awake. It was from my mother. Her words were clipped and formal, the kind of tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, but was sharpening a blade underneath. She wrote that my recent behavior was damaging the family's reputation, and that if I continued to breathe life into falsehoods, I would no longer be considered part of the Clark family. She added that I should think carefully before burning bridges I could never rebuild. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling, feeling that familiar mix of anger and disbelief. The next blow came an hour later when a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. Inside was a letter from the attorneys representing Clark & Sons, warning me that if I made any further public or private statements defaming Richard Clark or the company, they would pursue a defamation lawsuit against me. I could almost hear my father's voice, dictating the letter his satisfaction at forcing me into a corner. By noon, the corner tightened. My phone buzzed with a call from one of my largest design clients, a luxury condo developer I had worked with for years. His voice was strained as he told me he had to terminate our current contract for the penthouse interiors, citing unforeseen conflicts of interest. When I pressed, he finally admitted that Richard had personally called him, insinuating that I was unstable and that working with me could be a liability for future investors. The contract had been worth nearly $300,000. Hearing the number in my head made my pulse throb. I hung up my hands, trembling, and for a moment I just stood in the middle of my kitchen, staring at the counter as if it could anchor me. It didn't. Charlotte found me like that when she came by later. I told her what had happened each piece of the day, stacking on the last, until it felt like the air in the apartment was pressing down on us. She paced the living room, her jaw set. "This is exactly what he wants," she said. "He's cutting off your income so you don't have the resources to fight back." I went to my desk and pulled open the drawer where I had placed Peter Lang's link on a sticky note. The brass key from Grandma Rosemary's house was next to it. 2 potential weapons, each powerful in different ways. I told Charlotte that I was done waiting for him to make the next move. If he wanted to play hard, I could play harder. She stopped pacing and looked at me, weighing whether I was ready for what that meant. Her silence was answer enough. I picked up the sticky note and slid it into my pocket, feeling its thin edges like the outline of a blade. Then I wrapped my hand around the key, cold and solid, a reminder that somewhere in the Hamptons, evidence sat in a cedar closet waiting for me to claim it. That night I lay awake replaying the day in my mind. Every call, every letter, every calculated strike from my father was meant to remind me that he had the power to close doors in my life whenever he chose. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing what he could take from me. I was focused on what I could take from him. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. In that stillness, the plan began to form not as a single dramatic move, but as a series of deliberate steps. If he wanted to strip me of my work, my name, my standing, then I would strip him of the one thing he valued more than any of those combined: his untouchable image. Grandma Rosemary called me the next morning, her voice as calm as always, but carrying a weight I had learned to recognize. She asked me to come to her house in the Hamptons that afternoon. There was something she needed to give me, something she had kept for far too long. The drive out was quiet, the February sky a pale gray that seemed to press low over the winding roads. Her estate appeared at the crest of a hill, the same white clapboard mansion I had visited every summer as a child. Rosemary met me at the door, wrapped in a cream cardigan, her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She led me into the sitting room, where a fire burned low in the stone hearth. On the coffee table sat a cedar box, about the size of a large shoebox, its brass latch tarnished with age. She rested her hands on it for a long moment before looking at me. "This has been in my possession for 15 years, she said. "I think it's time you have it." I sat down across from her and waited as she slid the box toward me. The scent of cedar rose as I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked manila folders, each labeled in Rosemary's tidy handwriting. Bank statements, property deeds, contracts with signatures I recognized. There were printouts of email exchanges between Richard and executives whose names appeared in Ethan's diagrams, the kind of correspondence that could burn through a boardroom's polished facade. As I leafed through the documents, the scope of it began to sink in. This wasn't a collection of rumors or circumstantial ties. This was a map of deliberate, sustained fraud, recorded in his own words and numbers. My chest tightened with the knowledge that holding these papers meant holding a weapon powerful enough to end him. Rosemary sat back, her gaze steady. She began to speak of her own history of a time long before Clark and Sons had the glass tower in Manhattan. She told me how Richard's father had promised her a share of the family's holdings when she was a young widow, raising him only to have her cut out of the will by a last-minute change orchestrated by his second wife. She said she had learned then that in this family, loyalty was a one-way street. Her voice did not tremble, but I could hear the years in it, the weight of being pushed aside while others built their fortunes on ground she had helped lay. She said she had started collecting documents not out of spite, but as protection. Something to ensure that if the pattern of betrayal continued, there would be a record strong enough to fight back. I closed the lid and sat with my hands on the smooth wood, feeling the pulse of responsibility under my skin. This was more than a key to my father's downfall. It was an inheritance of a different kind, one forged in quiet resilience rather than public legacy. Rosemary reached across and placed her hand over mine. "Whatever you decide to do," she said, "do it, knowing you are not the first in this family to stand where you are, and you will not be the last." I carried the box out to my car as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the frozen lawn. The air was sharp in my lungs, and every step felt heavier than the one before. Back in the driver's seat, I set the box on the passenger side, the scent of cedar filling the cabin. As I started the engine, I glanced at it once more, knowing that whatever road I took next, there was no undoing the moment she had placed it in my hands. Charlotte called later that night, her voice low but urgent. She had reached out to a contact she trusted, someone who could navigate the kind of case we were walking into. Detective Laura Grant from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division was willing to meet discreetly the next day. Charlotte told me to bring the box and the video from Peter Lang and to be prepared for hard questions. We met Laura in a quiet corner booth of a coffee shop in Midtown, the kind of place where the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of strangers made it easy to blend in. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a posture that gave away nothing. I slid the cedar box across to her, along with a flash drive containing the video. She put on earbuds, watched the footage once, then again. Her jaw tightened at the moment my father brought the chair down. When she opened the box, she moved quickly, scanning documents, flipping through bank statements, snapping photos with a small device she kept in her jacket. After nearly 20 minutes, she closed it and leaned forward. "This is strong," she said. "But to initiate a federal case, we need at least one original contract or agreement with a verifiable signature tying him directly to the fraudulent activity. Without it, his attorneys could argue everything here is circumstantial or doctored." It was like a fist closing around my chest. I asked if the copies in the box would be enough, but Laura shook her head. "Originals have a weight in court that scans and photocopies, never will," she said. Charlotte and I exchanged a look. Rosemary's house was the obvious place to start, but the thought of going back there so soon, digging deeper into her private archives, felt like trespassing into her guarded past. Still, I knew there wasn't another option. The next morning we drove to the Hamptons under a steel sky. Rosemary greeted us with the same calm grace, though her eyes flickered with curiosity when I explained what we were looking for. She led us down to a storage room off the library, where rows of wooden shelves held decades of boxes labeled in her careful hand. The air smelled faintly of dust and cedar. I pulled on gloves and started opening boxes while Charlotte read out the labels. We sorted through property ledgers, handwritten letters, yellowed newspapers. After an hour, my back ached, and my hands were covered in fine powder from old paper. Just as I was about to take a break, I opened a flat archival box and saw a folder marked Ridgeway Holdings 2014. Inside was a thick contract on heavy stock paper. My father's signature sprawled across the bottom in bold blue ink, next to the name of a shell company that had surfaced in Ethan's financial map. Paper-clipped to the back was a notarized page confirming the agreement's execution date and signatories. It was exactly what Laura had described. I slipped it into a protective sleeve and closed the box, my pulse quickening. Rosemary watched quietly from the doorway, her expression unreadable. When I told her what we had found, she only nodded and said she had always suspected that piece of paper might someday matter. We drove back to the city without speaking much, the contract resting in a locked portfolio on my lap. Laura was waiting in an unmarked office building near the river. She examined the document under a magnifying lamp, checked the notary stamp, and photographed each page before placing it in a sealed evidence bag. "This is it," she said. "With this we can open a federal file. But you have to understand, once this moves forward, there's no pulling it back. And you need to keep this quiet. If he catches wind of what's coming, there's a very real chance he'll destroy or hide anything else that could corroborate this." I agreed, the weight of her warning settling in my chest. As we left the city, lights were beginning to glow against the darkening water. The portfolio felt lighter now, but the air between Charlotte and me was charged with the knowledge that we had just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. 2 days later, Charlotte called early in the morning with a tight edge in her voice. She told me to check my phone. A link was waiting in my messages, leading to a post on a niche financial blog that catered to real estate insiders and market speculators. The headline danced around the details, but the implication was unmistakable. A prominent New York family firm under quiet investigation for potential money laundering. No names, no dates, but the clues were obvious to anyone who had been following Clark & Son's aggressive property acquisitions. The comment section was already alive with theories, some reckless and others disturbingly close to the truth. By noon, the whispers had started to creep into the more public corners of the industry. Brokers, developers, and investment managers were suddenly mentioning my family's company in careful, measured tones. I knew it was only a matter of time before Richard responded. He never let a narrative slip from his control. That afternoon, his office announced a press conference. I watched it from my apartment, the television light flickering across my living room. Richard stood at the podium, flanked by Brandon and Evelyn, every inch the picture of righteous indignation. He spoke with the authority of a man used to commanding rooms, dismissing the blog post as baseless gossip. Then he did exactly what I had feared. He said there was a personal angle to these rumors, that a member of his own family had been trying to damage the company for personal gain. He called me by name. He called me an ungrateful daughter who had been given every opportunity and now sought to profit from false accusations. My phone lit up with messages. Some were from friends who didn't know what to believe, others from people in the industry offering quiet words of support. But the damage was immediate. Invitations to events I had been on the list for suddenly evaporated. A collaboration I had been negotiating with a high-profile design firm was put on hold without explanation. Charlotte came over that evening with takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat at my kitchen counter, scrolling through the day's coverage. Richard's performance had been polished, but the comments online told a different story. Half the voices seemed to echo his accusations, but the other half questioned why a respected businessman would attack his daughter so publicly if he truly had nothing to hide. In the days that followed, the city's social scene shifted like tectonic plates. Some people I had known for years avoided me entirely, afraid of being pulled into a scandal. Others, including a few I barely knew, reached out quietly, offering information or connections. Even among the family's oldest allies, lines were being drawn. I found myself on the receiving end of icy stares in lobbies and clipped conversations in hallways. At the same time, Ethan sent me a string of links to forums and back-channel threads. The blog post hadn't been a firestorm, but it had been enough to light a fuse. By the end of the week, a popular business news site had run a longer piece speculating about the company's finances, citing market chatter and unverified documents. Richard's lawyers issued another round of denials, but the unease was out in the open now. The rumor had become part of the conversation, and no amount of press polish could erase it entirely. One evening, as I walked home through the early spring chill, I passed two men in suits standing outside a restaurant. One of them lowered his voice, but not enough. "That family's finished if this sticks," he said. I kept walking, my heart beating faster, knowing that once people started saying things like that in public, the ground under Richard's empire was already shifting. The city felt like it was holding its breath when my phone vibrated. Peter said a copy of the video was out in the world, and that a reporter had asked him to confirm it was real. My chest tightened the way it had in the hospital when I tried to take a full breath. I asked if he could stop it. He said it was already moving, and the best I could do was prepare for what came next. I called Charlotte. She was still at her hotel near Bryant Park going through emails after a long day. I told her what Peter had said. She went quiet for a beat, and then told me we needed to alert Laura. I sent a short message to Laura, careful with every word. "Video may surface tonight. We have not shared it." She replied almost immediately and told us to stay off social media and not engage with anyone who reached out. She said she would call if she learned anything. I stood by the window and watched the lights along the avenue flicker against the glass. The phone buzzed again, then again. A friend I had not spoken to in months sent a link with a single line that made my stomach drop. "Is this your father?" I did not open it right away. I walked to the sink and filled a glass with water. I took a sip and set it down without swallowing. The glass trembled slightly on the counter. I sat on the edge of the couch, opened the link, and let it load. The screen filled with the ballroom at the Grand Regent, the camera steady and close. For a moment the sound was only music and clinking glasses and the soft rise of polite applause. Then my father came into frame. He stepped to the chair. The motion was clean and brutal. The edge caught my side, the camera jolted, and there was a sharp cry from somewhere I could not place. The sound cut through me, even though I knew it was mine. The audio picked up everything: the thud of the impact, the gasp that swept the room. My father's voice carrying in that confident baritone as he tried to regain control. Then the part that mattered most. He said a sentence that twisted my insides, a line that compared me to the people he laundered money with. No euphemism, no ambiguity. The words were clear enough that any viewer could transcribe them without guessing. Peter had been closer than anyone realized. I watched it twice without moving. On the third viewing, I noticed the small things. Evelyn frozen for a second, before her face reset into a social smile. Brandon glancing toward the cameras, then toward my father, then away. A waiter stepping forward and stopping at the invisible boundary where power and fear meet. Small choices that added up to a portrait of a family trying to hold a mask in place as it split. The video was everywhere within an hour. It was on platforms where teenagers traded gossip, and on feeds where bankers argued about rates. It was on message boards that specialized in scandal, and on private chats where socialites traded information behind locked names. My inbox filled with press requests, my phone filled with notifications until the screen felt like it had a pulse of its own. I turned it face down, and still felt the constant hum through the table. Charlotte arrived at my door in running shoes and a navy coat, her hair pulled back in a quick knot. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it as if holding back a wave. She said she had watched it 3 times in the cab and that the audio left no room for spin. We stood in the kitchen and listened to the city roar below us. She told me that if reporters showed up, I should not answer the door. She told me that if anyone from the company called, I should let it go to voicemail. Then she asked if I was all right. I nodded because answering felt dangerous, as if speaking would let everything I was holding back spill onto the floor. By midnight, the news programs had picked it up. A panel of commentators discussed the legal ramifications with the brisk certainty of people who had never sat in a hospital bed with ribs wrapped in bandages. One analyst said the words on the recording would interest federal investigators even more than the act of violence. Another said the board of Clark & Sons would have no choice but to distance itself if it wanted to survive. The anchor asked whether a man who assaulted his daughter in public could be trusted with the finances of clients around the world. The screen shifted to archival footage of my father cutting ribbons and shaking hands, the split screen turning a history of triumphs into an indictment. I checked my email and saw messages from clients who had once wanted my attention more than I wanted theirs. Some wrote with forced neutrality, hoping to keep options open. A few wrote with genuine concern. One apologized for ending our contract and said he had not known the whole story. He said he was willing to talk again when things settled. I read it twice and then closed my laptop, not ready to forgive the hour-old betrayal for a future promise. Calls came in from unknown numbers. I let them go to voicemail. One was a familiar voice from the company's legal team, using careful language about context and threats of legal action if I spoke publicly. Another was from a reporter I respected, saying she would run with or without my input and inviting me to correct the record. I deleted them both without listening to the end. Charlotte made tea and set a mug in front of me. She said Laura had texted her. The Bureau was monitoring the situation, and the best thing we could do was stay silent and let the video speak. Laura reminded us that the integrity of the case depended on not revealing the documents we had collected. The contract we had delivered was safe, she said, and the video would accelerate everything. I felt a small pocket of relief open in my chest at the word safe. Not long after Rosemary called from the Hamptons. Her voice was steady the way it had been when she handed me the cedar box. She said she had seen the clip, and for a long moment she said nothing more. Then she asked if I was with Charlotte. I told her yes. She said good, and that she would turn off her phone for the night because there would be a storm of calls. Before she hung up, she told me that the truth had a sound, and once people heard it, they could never unhear it. I pressed the phone to my ear after the call ended and let the silence sit there, a soft weight that did not crush me. By the time it was very late, the video had inspired think pieces and hot takes and shaky declarations from minor celebrities who wanted to be early to the conversation. A few of my father's loyalists rallied with statements about how stress and provocation could make any man act out. The replies were not kind. People posted the frame where the chair connected with my side. People found the old photos of charity galas and captioned them with grim humor. People who had always disliked him now had a number to call their feeling by. From the window I could see the glow of police lights several blocks away, unrelated to me, but still a reminder that other lives were cracking open at the same time as mine. I thought about the night at the hotel, about the first cold breath outside the side door, about the ambulance that did not run its siren so the press would not hear. I thought about Dr. Brooks writing the words consistent with assault, and the way my mother told me not to make a scene. All of it felt like it had been leading to this moment when the private rules of our family no longer applied in public. Charlotte sat beside me on the couch and asked if I wanted her to stay. I said yes. We watched the loop of the ballroom play again on a muted screen, the captioning doing its best to keep up with the noise of Crystal and panic. I tried to imagine what my father was doing in that moment. I saw him pacing the apartment on Fifth Avenue, instructing lawyers to draft statements calling board members by their first names, as if charm could solder a broken seam. I pictured Evelyn moving from room to room with her phone pressed to her ear, whispering to advisors and asking them how fast a story can die if you starve it. Sometime near dawn, my phone lit with Laura's name. She did not waste words. The video had been authenticated by more than one outlet. The frame-by-frame analysis matched the timestamp and the room. The audio could be enhanced if needed, but it was already clear to the human ear. She said the leak would speed up a series of steps that were already underway. She said I should keep my door locked and my schedule simple. She said she would be in touch soon. When the call ended, I set the phone on the table and watched the gray morning gather against the glass. The city had not yet decided what kind of day it would be. Traffic had not yet found its rhythm. For a few minutes there was quiet, the kind that comes before a front moves in. Charlotte closed her eyes and rested her head back. I folded my arms around myself and let the stillness hold. Agents in dark suits poured through the revolving doors of Clark & Sons just after 9 in the morning, their badges flashing under the lobby lights. The glass walls of the building reflected the winter sun, turning the scene into something too bright for what was about to happen. I stood across the street, the coffee in my hand cooling as I watched them split into teams and head for the elevators. Inside, the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's corner office framed him like a portrait. He was mid-conversation with 2 senior partners when the door opened and 2 agents stepped in. Their voices were calm but firm, their presence absolute. I could almost read his lips as they informed him that he was under arrest for federal crimes. Richard's face went through a quick, ugly progression from confusion to denial to a rage that tightened his jaw. He shoved back from his desk, sending his chair skidding against the wall. His voice carried even through the glass, sharp and venomous, but it didn't slow the agents. They moved in their hands, firm on his arms, reading him his rights as his protest turned to shouts. Evelyn appeared in the doorway moments later, her coat still draped over her shoulders as if she had just arrived. She froze her eyes, flicking from Richard to the agents to the small crowd gathering in the hall. When one of the agents turned to her with a question, she tried to steady her voice, but I could see her fingers tightening on her bag. More agents swept through the other floors, collecting file boxes, hard drives, anything with the Clark & Sons name on it. I recognized the head of IT being led out of the server room, his eyes down, clutching a laptop to his chest. The air around the building shifted, pedestrians slowing as they passed, sensing the magnitude of the moment without knowing the details. On the street, whispers began to ripple through the small crowd. Someone said they'd seen it on the morning news that the charges went beyond assault and into financial crimes that could span decades. Another voice said they'd heard Brandon was already removed from the executive board, his name scrubbed from the company website overnight. Across the street, Charlotte stepped up beside me, her gaze fixed on the building. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. The sound of sirens grew louder as a black SUV pulled up, 2 more agents stepping out to join the procession inside. Through the glass, I saw Richard glance once toward the street, his eyes catching on the crowd. For a moment, I thought he had spotted me, but if he did, he gave no sign. The agents guided him toward the elevators, his shoulders stiff, his voice still rising in sharp bursts. Evelyn followed a different group down the hall. Her posture clipped, her expression set in a mask I had seen her wear at charity galas when she was pretending not to notice an insult. But this time the performance wasn't for society pages. It was for survival. When Richard emerged from the lobby, his wrists in cuffs, a wall of cameras surged forward. Reporters shouted questions, the flash of bulbs lighting up the cold air. He turned his face away, but the image was already captured, already making its way across the internet. I stayed where I was watching as they loaded him into the back of the SUV. The door shut with a final solid sound, and the convoy pulled away from the curb. Around me, people began to disperse, their conversations low but charged. Charlotte exhaled slowly, the fog of her breath lingering in the air. This was what we had worked toward, the inevitable end we had pushed into motion. And yet standing there, I felt not triumph, but a quiet, certain recognition. The story wasn't over, but for the first time it was being written on my terms. The seasons moved quickly after that day, each one peeling away another layer of what my life used to be. By the time the leaves began to turn again, the verdict had been read in a federal courtroom, and Richard was led away in a plain jumpsuit, his face drained of the authority he once wielded like a weapon. The sentence was long enough that he would never again step into Clark & Sons as anything more than a cautionary tale. Evelyn faded from public view, her name slowly disappearing from the charity boards and society columns she had fought to be part of. Word came through distant acquaintances that she had left the state, and no one seemed to know or care where she had gone. Brandon slipped quietly into another life, relocating to a small coastal town several states away. His once constant stream of social media posts dried up until his accounts were abandoned entirely. I did not follow him, and I did not miss him. The silence was its own form of closure. Grandma Rosemary, steady as ever, took the momentum of what we had endured and built something lasting. She established the Rosemary Madison Arts Fund, $18 million, dedicated to supporting young artists and designers who lacked the kind of opportunities my family had once taken for granted. She insisted my name stand beside hers, not as a footnote, but as a statement. When I tried to protest, she told me it was not charity, it was legacy. With the weight of my father's shadow lifted, I returned to my work with a clarity I had never known. The clients who had stayed through the chaos were loyal, and new ones came drawn by the independence my name now carried. I opened my own design studio in a sunlit loft in the Flatiron District, its walls lined with sketches and fabric swatches instead of family portraits. Every decision, every piece that left those doors bore only my signature. Some days, I would pass the Clark & Sons building on my way to meet a client. The glass still gleamed, but the name had changed, sold off to new owners who had no connection to the history that had once been written there. I never went inside. It belonged to another life, one I had survived, but no longer needed to revisit. Charlotte visited often, her laughter filling my apartment, in ways that reminded me that family could be chosen and nurtured, not just endured. Ethan's articles on corporate corruption began to reference the Clark case less directly, but I could see in his work the same commitment to truth that had drawn me to trust him in the first place. Detective Laura Grant occasionally sent brief updates, more out of courtesy than necessity, the case long since closed. On the anniversary of that night in the ballroom, I hosted a small gathering at my studio. The guests were artists, clients, and friends, people who knew me not as Richard's daughter, but as Madison Clark in her own right. The room was filled with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the warm light of a space that had been built without compromise. When the last guest left and the city's evening settled against the windows, I stood in the middle of the room and let the stillness sink in. There was no vindictive thrill, no lingering desire to see more punishment handed down. The victory was not in their loss, but in my freedom to define myself without their approval. If there was one thing I carried from all of it, it was the understanding that justice is not just a courtroom sentence. Sometimes it is the act of standing up, of refusing to be diminished, of claiming your place when others have tried to erase it. And if you are listening now, take this with you. No one has the right to define your value but you. Not your family, not your past, not the people who have hurt you. Stand up for yourself. Protect what matters to you, and write your story in your own voice. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you stay connected here, because every story told is another reminder that we are more than what we've endured.